Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Kate, I make videos about books and bookish things, and I have finished first year. Yes, just over a week ago I had my last exam, and so now I am in the period of liminal space where I have nothing that I am obligated to do apart from the play that I'm currently producing, and so I'm free. I'm free to do whatever I fancy, so I thought I would do another video recapping the last books that I read. I didn't actually end up doing a huge amount of reading at the start of this term, ahead of exams, because I had 1 week of lectures and then it was just revision and then exams. So I mostly did the reading over the holidays and in the last couple of weeks of the last term. I just thought I'd go through them to fully round out this little 3-part series of what Kate was forced to read for her first year of her degree. For the final time, the modules that I take, I do 6 modules this year that are all equally weighted, and those are Introduction to the Novel, Introduction to Drama, Introduction to Poetry, and then Classical and Biblical Backgrounds to English Literature, Romance and the Literature of Chivalry, and Epic and the Literature of Legend. Let's jump into it. So I have my list all prepared, and I'm just going to go through it quickly. So, the final things that I read for my degree were Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie. I know I mentioned it in the last one, but I've actually finished it now. The Saga of Gili Surson, Aristotle's Poetics, Top Girls by Carol Churchill, The Song of Roland, Angels in America by Tony Kushner, The Metamorphoses by Ovid, Le Morte d'Arthur by Thomas Mallory, In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, and The Watchmen comics by Alan Moore. So, as before, I'll just go through the stuff that I thought was worth talking about. Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie was such an interesting book. As predicted, the majority of my reading was very, very white. Very white and American, very white and British. We got a little bit of European stuff in there, but very, very rarely did it touch on countries that were not the Western ones, and especially it did not touch on perspectives that were not Western, so it was a really refreshing thing to read some writing by a British Indian, specifically about growing up in Bombay, now Mumbai, and I loved it. I thought it was such an interesting book. It takes magical realism in a really fascinating way. In the introduction, Salman Rushdie says he does not view this book as magical realism because that's just how it was growing up. It wasn't magical realism, life was truly just that magical, which I thought was such a beautiful and interesting perspective on writing, particularly sort of a growing up memoir, and talking about life being this magical, amazing thing, and then blending it with the moments of quite sort of stark realism was fantastic. It was just really, really interesting to have such a completely different style of writing, tackling a really different topic and perspective to anything else that we covered across the module. I was really, really grateful to have had it put on the list. I'm really, really glad I read it, despite the fact it was nearly 600 pages, so it was not something I was particularly enthused to be reading towards the end of term, but I have to say I really enjoyed it, and it informed the module choices I've made for next year because I realised I want to read more stuff from perspectives that I just haven't before. You know, especially over the last couple of years I've really been making an effort to diversify the books I read just for leisure, broadly from perspectives that are not my own. And so it's going to be really interesting to do that within my degree as well. Aristotle's Poetics is one that I talked about in, I believe, the last video, saying that I hadn't actually read it, despite it having been covered in lectures. Well, I got around to my second set of essays and realised that I needed it in order to write an essay I wanted to do, so I read it. And it was quite useful. It was very useful cross-module because although it was on the classical and biblical portion as a piece of classical writing, it is about theatre and the way that theatre works and the way that Aristotle believes theatre should be done. So it was a really, really interesting way to see how perspectives of theatre and performance have evolved, and it was just broadly quite interesting. Also very short, it was about 60 pages long. Can't complain. Top Girls by Carol Churchill, a really interesting piece of modern feminist socialist theatre, and we love shitting on Margaret Thatcher. I initially read it thinking it was going to be just straightforwardly feminist, and so I wasn't very critical of Marlene, the main character. However, when I finished, I went, ooh, this feels a bit different. And so after the tutorial, I realised that actually we are not meant to see Marlene as a top girl, a successful woman who has, beaten the odds, broken through the glass ceiling, and has achieved a top position within an employment firm. Instead, we are meant to see her as a paragon of the kind of feminism that says you stomp down everyone else on the way to getting to the top yourself and damn the others, that's their problem, which I thought was so interesting, especially as I say, a fairly feminist piece of literature, to acknowledge the impact that capitalism has on ideas of independence and freedom and success. Yeah, a really, really interesting one, and I wrote about it a lot in my final essay and then in my exams because I just thought it was a really, really interesting text. Carol Churchill also has this innovation of doing overlapping dialogue. She will put slashes through lines of dialogue to indicate that a character is meant to start talking while a character is doing their lines, which is something I've seen done in theatre before, but not put into the script itself. And, you know, I said plenty in my writing about the fact that this is both a symbol of, you know, community among women, the way that women just chatter together and our voices all blend together, but also of competing, of shouting down other women, of making sure that you are heard over another woman. Really interesting, and definitely a play I'd be interested in seeing in performance to see how this actually works on stage. Angels in America. Okay, so the last video I did last term was a little vlog of my final week in which I read Angels in America, and it's a masterpiece. It is truly a sensational piece of theatre. It is the length of an average novel. In performance, it's between 6 and 8 hours long, and it is absolutely worth every word, every page, every line of dialogue. It is phenomenal. It is the story of a man dying of AIDS in America in the 1980s and of the very complicated relationships he has with his partner who leaves him after he is diagnosed, with a Mormon woman he meets first in a dream/hallucination, and with the politics of the day, specifically with Roy Cohn, who was a very prominent politician during this period. And about the fact that as he is dying of AIDS, he starts having prophetic dreams and is visited by an angel who tells him he is the new prophet of America, and the ways that the politics and religious ideas intersect with him as just a really sick, unhappy man. And it's incredible. It's such a good play. Fortunately, it is available on archive.org, the place I've been reading pretty much everything for my degree, and it's just a fantastic play. The one on archive.org is the National Theatre production from, I believe, 2018, with Andrew Garfield as Prior Walter, who is the main character, essentially. And it is just sensational. I cannot recommend it enough. It is very intense, it is very graphic at points, but it is truly one of those things that I think you have to see in order to appreciate just what can be achieved through art, theatre, performance. I am so glad that I had to read this for my degree, because otherwise I might have missed out on this as part of my experience as a human, and yeah, everyone deserves it, frankly. Le Morte d'Arthur. So I read Chrétien de Troyes' Story of the Grail, the story of Percival, at the very, very beginning of my university career, and I thought it was great. I thought it was really entertaining. Then I read Le Morte d'Arthur, or chunks of it that I was forced to, and went, cool, so this is why everyone thinks that the Round Table and all the Arthurian legends are boring as shit. Because it's boring! Chrétien de Troyes makes it way more entertaining. Fuck Thomas Mallory. I don't know what I'm saying at this point. I didn't enjoy it. I'll move on. In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. I had so much fun just absolutely wailing on this man in my tutorial, because this is just badly written, frankly. I did not think it was a well-written book. I did not think it was an example of well-done fictional non-fiction. I just thought it was a bit rubbish. It is supposedly a journalistic retelling and exploration of the Clutter family murders that happened in a tiny Kansas town in the 1950s, 60s, talking about the murder and the aftermath and the way in which the criminals who murdered them were tried and executed. It claims to be journalistic, however, it is the most biased piece of writing I've read in such a long time. To the point where Truman Capote inserts himself to talk about how terrible the wallpaper is in the house of this family that's been murdered. It's just kind of funny. I did not enjoy it at all. I think it's badly written. Yeah, not my favourite, but very entertaining to talk about how his idea of non-fiction is so far from the bounds of non-fiction. I can appreciate it as heralding a new, genre within a genre, but it's not good. And then finally, the last thing that I read for my degree was the Watchmen comics by Alan Moore. I was not expecting to enjoy this, and yet I did. So, for context, I've never interacted with any sort of superhero media, Marvel, DC, or otherwise. It's just not really something I've ever dabbled in, especially not comics. I've read graphic novels, I've read web comics, you know, I love Lore Olympus, I love Heartstopper, but I've never done comics as they were traditionally printed. And so to read comics done as a graphic novel, specifically 1980s gritty realism superhero comics, was very out of my comfort zone. But I got really invested in it. I wasn't expecting to gel with the format, with the themes, and especially not the way in which it tells the story. Watchmen is an example of the sort of rise of grimdark, which I mostly know from watching overly sarcastic productions, as with most things to do with literature. But it is about this sort of take on superheroes as being real human beings and the impacts of their superheroism on themselves, the real world, and their fellow superheroes. And so it is all about the really dark side of being a superhero, of existing in a city where superheroism is perhaps needed, perhaps not. But I really got invested. It took until, so there's about 12 issues in total, I believe, and it took about until the fourth one for me to get invested, because that was the one that explored the origins of Dr. Manhattan. And that issue is just a masterpiece. The symbolism in it, the actual story of how Dr. Manhattan gains his superpowers, because he is the only superhero who actually has powers, and yet he is a severely fucked up individual. It was so interesting, and I think that was what really got me thinking, no, I'm invested in these characters and I actually really want to finish reading this. Completely out of my depth, completely out of my comfort zone, and I was not expecting to gel with it, especially because I enjoy light-hearted stories. I like realism, but only if it ultimately feeds a fairly optimistic message, and Watchmen is depressing as shit. It's really miserable and political, and it is all about the worst parts of humanity, essentially. You know, most of the main characters end up dead, disappointed, or completely disillusioned with the world by the end of it, and yet I enjoyed it. I was rooting for them. Yeah, really interesting. Rorschach is such a fascinating character. He's mostly the one whose perspective you see from throughout the series, and he's fascinating. Not a good character, but a really interesting one, and I think it's been very, very good at helping me see how different kinds of stories can do different things with characters, because I tend to take a fairly straightforward approach of, if this character is good, I'll like them, if they're bad, I won't. And so it was quite good at opening my mind to the possibility of enjoying things without condoning them. Yeah, I think that's my soapbox talk about Watchmen. I don't need to say it's underrated, because I have a feeling that's just from my limited experience of its impacts, but yeah, definitely one to explore, even if you don't think it's something you'd necessarily be into, because I didn't. And this was, you know, prescribed reading for my degree, so I was gonna do it anyway, but then I did read it and went, ooh, I quite like that. So yeah, that is everything I read for the first year of my degree. I haven't talked about absolutely everything, and certainly not everything in as much detail as I possibly could have done, but this was the stuff that I thought was worth mentioning, either because it met my expectations, exceeded them, greatly underperformed, or just because it has been interesting to me. I've done first year now. I'm here for another month, essentially just kicking about, having fun, enjoying being a student. And I have to say, I've really enjoyed my first year. This was definitely the degree for me. I've enjoyed everything about this, pretty much. Even the stuff I haven't enjoyed reading, I've enjoyed picking apart or just complaining about with my friends on the course. And yeah, bring on year two. I can't wait for it. So yeah, thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope it's been insightful. Feel free to like this video if you did indeed like it, and comment down below if you've read any of these things, what were your thoughts on them, or if any of the things I didn't talk about, let me know what you thought. I always like to hear what other people's experiences have been like. Yeah, let's just have a chat about books, as always. Feel free to subscribe if you want to see more of me and my bookish content, and I will see you next time.